Okay, so I think it's 1 p.m. sharp and we're ready to begin. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion, Rethinking Affordable Housing Post-COVID-19. This is being organized by the Urban Innovations Working Group at Columbia University. The COVID-19 pandemic has accentuated a global need for affordable housing solutions. Acknowledging the challenges faced in this sector, this year's edition of UN Habitat's Urban October highlights the theme, Housing for All, a Better Urban Future. The Urban Innovations Working Group at Columbia University seeks to contribute to this effort by bringing experts in the field to discuss this topic with students. And as a result, we're pleased to have with us 5 experts sharing their presentations on how they are rethinking affordable housing within their organizations. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today, Paul Lagunas. Paul Lagunas is the professor for comparative urban policy at the School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University. His research work examines the problem of corruption, especially as it affects urban governments in the Americas. Thank you, Paul, for moderating our event. I invite you to make the opening remarks.
Pankti, thank you very much. I'll keep my remarks brief since you're really not here to see me. You're here to see our extraordinary panelists. And I want to say it's an honor, a true honor to be the moderator of this event. I expect that I will learn plenty from listening to our panelists. And I also want to take a moment to congratulate the organizers of the event. The employers or potential employers who are listening into this event should really look closely at the students who organize this event. They've done a wonderful job. And I'm genuinely impressed of all the events I've been involved in or I've participated in or helped organize at SIPA. I haven't seen, or there are few events I've seen organized as well and as carefully. What to expect? So my role is that of a faithful timekeeper. Each panelist will have 10 minutes. I will announce when they have 5 minutes through the chat, 3 minutes, 1 minute, and then when time is up, I will unmute myself and ask for the panelists to conclude. We will hear from Giulia, David Smith, Richard Koss, Marco, and David Cleghorn in that order. Pankti Dalal, I've asked her to please help me introduce the panelists since again, my main role here is to be the faithful timekeeper, and I will also offer a couple of remarks after each panel. With that, Pankti, if you would do us the honor of introducing our first speaker.
Thank you, Paul. Our first speaker for today is Giulia Lavagna. Giulia is an Italian architect and urban planner working as Associate Human Settlement Officer for UN Habitat. Her work within the Land, Housing and Shelter section focuses on the coordination and implementation of the UN Habitat housing policy portfolio, managing projects that strengthen the capacities of national and local governments in formulating and implementing evidence-based housing policies. Giulia is also a doctoral candidate in public and urban policy at the New School University in New York. Her research explores the effectiveness of inclusionary housing programs in leveraging the support of the private sector to provide affordable housing in developing countries. Giulia, we're very happy to have you with us. I welcome you to make the presentation.
I can see it on now, so let's start. So I'm here on Canada as was working with the one, which is I'm going to a few of the key institutional and global agendas that we work on. So housing for all, when we talk about housing for all, we talk about inclusive, sustainable, and affordable housing for all. Now you can go to the next slide. I'll do this first part. So you're aware of the 2030 SDG on sustainable cities and community, which is the SDG 11. And there's a specific target on housing, which is the target 11.1, which is aiming to ensure access to adequate and affordable housing by 2030. I think there's still a lot to do, but that's what we're all aiming to. Slide the following other agenda that new urban 2020. Housing is also central in the new urban agenda, and it's framed into the way of providing equal access to affordable housing. Next slide, please. In the overarching umbrella of these agendas is the international human. It doesn't sound as part of the right to adequate standards of living, which is officially recognized as one of the human rights. Next slides, please. And UN Habitat works with this approach that we call housing at the center, position endorsed by the Governing Council of Habitat, which is the governing body of our agency, that basically put housing at the center both of policies as well as cities. So we always preach the fact that housing should be mined when we're urban planning for urban development, housing as well as center of city, very well connected to the urban fabric. Next slide, please. Just to give you an overview of how the housing program in UN Habitat is structured for your own sake of interest. So we three key, so building housing, making sure they're not behind. Housing as a vector economic development, prosperous society. So housing is not just the four walls, is the entire ecosystem that it goes around housing. And then finally, we see as building housing as building sustainable cities. So cities are made of houses as well. So that's why housing is so in urban development. We have folio is on course adequate and affordable housing. Sorry, let me try to turn off my video because I hear that it's breaking up a bit. I hope you can hear me better now. If not, I might try to join on.
Yeah, Giulia, I would go ahead and continue, and we'll do what we can in following. But yeah, cutting off the video probably does help. Thank you.
Sorry, let's see if it works. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, amazing. I've switched from my phone. So the three key portfolio that we have are the one around adequate and affordable housing, the one around inclusive housing and the right to adequate housing, as well as the one on green and resilient housing, which is everything around sustainability and the production cycle. And the three level of work that UN Habitat does as an UN agency are technical cooperation. So we give direct support to national and local governments in framing policies and programs around housing. We do normative work. So for example, developing guidelines on housing principles and global housing standards that falls under the normative work. And then finally, there's everything around advocacy and outreach. And at the very end of the presentation, I'll give you an example of that. Next slide. Thanks. So let's get into the topic of today's discussion and the COVID-19 and the housing crisis and the reason why I framed that in this way. Next slide, please. I think that you've seen, I mean, any of us has been touched in a way or another by COVID in the very basics of our daily lives. And I just would like to go over with you some of the key measures, prevention measures that all governments have mostly put in place to prevent the spread of the COVID-19. So the very first measure is about isolation and quarantine measures. So people were asked to stay at home. And this is something simple if you do have a home, but staying at home for somebody is not really an option. And here we can see a picture of homeless in Las Vegas. So it's not so far away from New York City. The second prevention measure is around hand washing and hygiene measure. So again, it's easy if you do have water in your household. Our headquarters is based in Kenya, and in the slums area, having water just for washing hands it's hard. It's not easy, and we had to install water stations for people to be able to even wash their hands, because sometimes water is lacking just for the very basic needs. And then finally, we go into slightly more elaborated measures to ensure housing affordability, such as rent freeze or moratorium on mortgages or housing vouchers or utilities shut off, to make sure that those that have lost their livelihoods and their jobs are not affected further by the fact that they will not be able to pay rent and so on. And the eviction bans is a direct consequence of this. Next slide, please. So I'll present you here just a few of the key data that we're working on. So we're seeing that there's a discussion around density and overcrowding. And basically what UN Habitat is stating lately is that the COVID-19 has brought nothing new under the spotlight. It has just shown the existing global housing crisis in a more prominent way and in a more kind of rough way under the eyes of everyone. So we are looking, for example, we're trying to study the correlation between overcrowding and COVID-19. As I was saying, initially density was accused to be one of the key issues of and one of the key reasons why COVID was spreading so easily, but is actually not urban density, the one that is affecting the COVID-19 spread, but it is the overcrowding, so the livelihoods of people living in overcrowded households. Next slide, please. And then secondly, we've seen this eviction crisis. I think now countries will start revoking their eviction bans, and just in the US, there will be probably around 30 to 40 million people at risk of being evicted in the next few months. So this will be on unprecedented scales, and it's affecting just as much developed countries as well as developing. Living in a slum, you're still paying a rent, and if you're not able to pay a rent, you'll still be evicted by your shelter. Next slide, please. So what's the position of UN Habitat? What's the thinking that we've been doing around this? Next slide, please. I think that the first very key issue that we had to highlight is the need to rethink about housing, the need to go back at that very old law of the 1946 and remember everyone that housing is a human right. And so when governments are providing food vouchers, well, food and housing are just as much as two human rights. So what does that mean? What kind of role governments should be having towards housing? What does it mean that housing needs to go into the welfare, needs to be included into the welfare system discussion? And also what's the position and what's the role the government should be having in ensuring that everyone has the right to adequate housing? I think this is a very complex question that as UN Habitat, we don't have yet an answer. But what we know is that we need to rethink the way we see housing, and not just as a commodity, but as really a fundamental right to be ensured to everyone. Next slides, I can see I have just 1 minute left. What does it mean rethinking housing to make sure that everyone get the right access to housing? Is this a responsibility just of government? Well, we don't think so. We think that housing should be seen as a shared responsibility, and for this reason, a collective response should be it's necessary to achieve the right to adequate housing for all. And what does that mean? It means the national governments need to provide the adequate policy framework for all the other stakeholders to be able to work properly around this issue. It means the local authorities need to ensure citizens access to adequate housing. It means that the civil society organization should keep contributing and should get a greater responsibility and greater role in ensuring partnership with local residents as well as the private sector. We think the private sector is a key actor, is a key player in the housing sector, and so it needs to get on board, and it needs to have a good degree of collaboration with governments at all levels. And then finally, a research institute like Columbia, they are the one really producing evidence and data for the formulation of policies and responses. And as international community, the UN agencies, the UN Habitat in this case particularly, is of course the first role is mobilizing support and the international community around this. And just to conclude, I'm almost done. Next slide, please. I would like to show you what we have done in the very last few days. So I hope this presentation will be shared with you, but here you can find the flyer of the housing campaign that we have just launched, and I will encourage you to all go to the website and check it and see what kind of contributions are being shared around this housing campaign. But also I'm sharing here with you some links and also some in the notes of the PowerPoint around the roundtable that we had on housing at the center of the COVID-19 response, in case you might be interested in digging further the conversation that we had on Monday, October 5th, as well as the housing and social protection to end homelessness that we have done in partnership with UNDESA, together with a report on that. Next slides, and this is the very final. I'll encourage you all to watch this very touching documentary, which was prepared by Boris Bertram, The Human Shelter, and is showing different ways of conceiving housing all over the world. UN Habitat is supporting this, and it has been sponsored by Kia. So I encourage you all to go and watch the movie. And this is just a taste of what does it mean doing advocacy at the global level. This is my last slide. I think you can go to the next one, but it's just for the thank you.
Thank you.
And as a very last remark, I just would like to flag that UN Habitat is always looking for talent. Since Paul, you mentioned that there's a good pool of very interesting profile in this meeting. So I encourage you all to look for internship and consultancies, and to reach out in case you're interested in collaborating with us on the topic of housing. So thank you very much for giving me the chance to join you today.
Thank you, Giulia. Wonderful presentation. Briefly, I really appreciate your comment about, well, first I appreciate you're helping us manage the intricacies of connecting, and sometimes, you know, technology doesn't always work in our favor, and you found a solution and you adapted, and your presentation was excellent. Thank you very much, Giulia. In terms of the substance of your presentation, you know, I really appreciate your point that housing is more than the four walls that, you know, the home that we call home. It's an entire ecosystem. I also very much appreciate how you're noting that the pandemic has made the issue of housing much more central, and much where just the public is much more mindful of it than I think it would be in other circumstances. So all those things I think help us carry through or carry on with this panel. Giulia, thank you very much. And I do want to say that yes, we will be sending you candidates for potential employment at UN Habitat. So thank you for making those spots available to our extraordinary and very talented students at SIPA. Giulia, thank you very much. We will engage you further during the Q&A. But now I want to turn the microphone back to Pankti Dalal, who will help me introduce David Smith. And again, I will be keeping time, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 1 minute, and time's up.
Thank you, Paul. I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, David Smith. David Smith is the founder and CEO of the Affordable Housing Institute, which develops sustainable housing financial ecosystems worldwide. He has over 45 years of direct experience in affordable housing. His work as an international housing finance policy advisor encompasses projects in more than 30 countries. In the US, David provides high quality analysis to Congress, the Millennial Housing Commission, CBO, HUD, and others, and was a principal member of the 1996 Senate Mark to Market Working Group. A 1975 Harvard graduate, he's an award-winning author with more than 400 published articles in real estate, valuation, policy periodicals, and a textbook, as well as an influential blog. Thank you for being with us today, David. I request you to start your presentation.
Okay, I'm old. I think about housing all the time. I'm a structured finance and transactions guy, and I'm a graduate of the Yogi Berra School of Management. You can observe a lot just by watching. And what I want to do for all of you folks is take you through what we've been trying to do to operationalize some of the principles Giulia described as being part of the UN Habitat approach. I'm going to do this through basically 4 content slides, which I promise Paul I will get done in less than 10 minutes because I will talk fast and we'll take advantage of the good broadband. I start with the following premise. For most of the 20th century, we take aspects of housing for granted. But with our little viral friend, the developed world discovered something that the emerging world has never forgotten, that your housing can be unhealthy with respect to contagious disease. As a result, in the developed world, and much of my presentation will be about the developed world, even though as Pankti referenced, I've worked in a lot of countries. I actually counted it up, Pankti, the other day, and it's 48 personally at this point, a lot of them. Pre-COVID housing is now health obsolete. And what that means for the developed world, and I respectfully suggest for the relationship between the developed and the emerging world, is that we're not going back. As Giulia mentioned in her presentation, housing is a much more important asset class than it was before. And in the US, and I would submit in the developed world, and I think Giulia has provided an in-kind example of this, free-to-use or high-quality broadband is now a public health utility. And I would suggest also that so is free-to-use or mobile banking. A whole series of forms of the urban environment, retail, leisure, office, have all been disrupted because housing's taking a bigger share of the workday, it's taking a bigger share of the education day, taking a bigger share of the leisure day. Very disruptive thing. We're not through the disruption and we are not going back. So I want you to learn some simple lingo because you will see the world differently. Human social encounters can be described in epidemiological contagious disease terms as either wet or dry. Wet, you can get sick from me, I can get sick from you. Dry, we do exactly the same social encounter, but nobody can get sick from the other. A physical conference is a high wet encounter. A virtual conference is a dry encounter. This is important because even after we deal with this little viral thing, the more dense a city is, the greater the number of wet encounters and the greater the potential for contagious disease. So as we re-engineer human social processes, we're going to want to re-engineer them so that they involve more dry encounters where possible. And the third kind of encounter is a scrub encounter. Scrub encounter is something that you do that whatever you did earlier in the day that was wet is no longer wet and is now dry. Next thing that's happened, very important thing that's happened, Giulia made reference to it, and Paul, I think you did as well. The impact of the virus and the disruption of the physical forms of work have exposed the fragility of social support systems, particularly around food, medications, access to health, family connections. All of those systems of social support for people who need help have been significantly disrupted and have to be reinvented around the lens of housing. What that also means is that our view of health information versus our views of privacy are now changed. In America in particular, we say many things are supposed to be private. But now, what you don't know about your neighbor can kill you, even if your neighbor doesn't mean it. So governments all around the world have been redefining what constitutes public health information. There are over 100 apps for phones that do contact tracing. Fastest fastest downloaded app in the world came from India. It's Arogya Setu, 165 million downloads, and it does contact tracing, and many employers depend upon it as something to bring before they bring employees back into the office. There's one in France called Stop COVID. Your mileage may vary. In the US, it's going to be Amazon or Facebook, and of course, everybody trusts them. And that's the last point I want to make on this slide. We have to redefine the trust relationship between landlord and tenant, employer and employee, neighbor and neighbor. Because the only way we can live in an urban environment is if we live in something that we believe is health secure. Once you're home, you're safe. And that means that in effect, everyone you live with is your health family. Universities are struggling with this right now. Everybody who lives in a dorm is part of your health family. All the outsiders and insiders who frequently come through the doors, in some sense, they're part of your health family. Because what do we know with a big family? If the little kid gets sick, everybody gets sick. Us having a stake in each other's wellness means that we have to redefine the trust relationships between people who heretofore did not normally pass private information and trust each other. And that leads us to 5 elements as we retrofit the built environment. Medical, we have to have medical testing, medical awareness. Physical, operational, informational, and economic and finance. I haven't got time to go through all the details, but those are the 5 things you have to examine and consider retrofitting or building new in your design or your urban policy. The other thing I can tell you from having 100 million years doing this is that over the last 50 years, there've been a whole series of public health crises as it related to the built environment. Lead-based paint in 1979, asbestos in the late 1980s, underground storage tanks, in case you didn't know what those are, sprinklers in high-rises, radon and mold. All 6 of them have gone through the following normative process: inspect and report, remediate emergent hazards, encapsulate or isolate lingering but controllable hazards, retrofit the next time a bunch of money goes by, certify it, whether it's LEED or otherwise, tap new favorable financing via certification. Whoops, get back to the slideshow. And I think it's going to redefine the role of employers and employees. And so here's a bunch of exit questions for your consideration. What changes in the housing ecosystem are going to be inevitable? Not desirable, but inevitable. What's going to change about policy? What's going to change about law? What's going to change about regulations? What's going to change about economics? How are we going to design prospectively? And how are we going to retrofit existing housing? Something like 90% of all the housing that will exist in 2030 exists now. And most of the housing that exists now globally is informal and will be self-improved. How do we reprice? And what changes are going to arrive when? And the question for people like us is, how do we constructively shape that change? We can't control it, but we can guide it and we can influence it. Some paradigms are obsolete. You have to recognize they're obsolete, which is hard to do. You got to think about what comes after. You got to think of new partnerships, new alliances. Got to find opportunities to jump ahead, such as in this talk, because I'm being pestered by the moderator that I'm running long. And we need to know what we need to know. You see, what you don't know doesn't get you. What gets you is what you know that turns out not to be true or not to be true today. And so with that, I invite you to consider the 5 things. By the way, we are inventing this. The best way to predict the future is to invent it. We got a grant from NeighborWorks. We got a grant from NCSHA. We have another grant coming. We're trying to make the change because if you figure out how to do this, everybody will want to adopt it. And with that, as they say in the US Senate, I yield the balance of my time.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much, David Smith. Thank you very much for your presentation. There's a lot there. There's a lot of, your presentation reflects a lot of consideration of the issues we're dealing with. I want to highlight just a couple of them that are at the front of my mind. So one is this idea that I had not heard of this distinction between wet and dry. And we had considered the course that I teach that Ricardo and Pankti are part of, the idea that density is in a sense a liability, or as you would put it, I think, without putting words in your mouth, but I think I would take your vocabulary and learning from it. I would say that density essentially raises the likelihood of wet encounters. And so that was really fascinating to consider. And that's something we'll continue to live with post-COVID, which is something you're warning about. You're kind of telling us, let's learn from COVID and let's adapt toward the future. David Smith's presentation also underscored something very fundamental to our experience with COVID, and that's the role of trust in society. That is something that I don't think is discussed enough in mainstream media. And I really appreciate that David Smith's presentation is highlighting that. As you said, David, we have to acknowledge that the stake that we have in each other's wellness. We have to acknowledge the stake that we have in each other's wellness. In other words, we're all connected. So David Smith, thank you very much for your presentation. We are now going to listen from Richard Koss. Again, I will be a faithful timekeeper, but I will ask Pankti to kindly introduce our panelists for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Our next speaker for today is Richard Koss. Richard Koss is the Chief Research Officer at Recursion Co. and Adjunct Professor at the School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, at Columbia University. In his third year, he teaches courses on global housing policy and affordable housing finance. He has also acted as faculty advisor to capstone projects in the subject area. At Recursion, Richard leads the firm's research and product development areas based on cutting-edge big data tools. Prior to joining Recursion, Ross worked as the head of capital markets research at Fannie Mae and recently served as IMF visiting scholar and director of the Global Housing Watch. I kindly invite Richard to make his presentation.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I appreciate it very much. I'd also like to thank the Urban Innovations Working Group for asking me to join this very distinguished panel and to talk about such timely and important topics. As mentioned, by background, I'm an economist and a finance guy these days with a heavy data overlay, and I try to emphasize in everything I do the importance of data and information in terms of decision making for both the private and public sectors. So let me share my screen. So what I deal with here is I look at several themes. So I look at themes from somewhat a big picture goal in terms of what are we looking at in terms of the current environment and the future environment, and what can we bring from our past experience, and what is it that we need to rethink completely. And so I have several themes in this regard that I will try to work through. There we go. Okay, so here we're looking at a period of great and enormous change. We're rethinking the way we live and the way we work. And what I have here is a picture I found relatively recently in the Atlantic, which came from Life magazine in 1958, which was the booming period of the suburbs, which, although driven by different factors, has some similarities to now. What's remarkable there are all of those delivery trucks and how dependent those of us who lived in the suburbs have been on such systems and technology, in this case likely just the telephone, that could enable this lifestyle to grow and blossom. One of the themes is perhaps we are looking at this lifestyle again, although probably from a bit more diverse and less gender stereotypes coming into play here, but somehow there's some familiarity. In terms of looking at the shock of COVID, what I have here is a chart that I lifted from my friends at Redfin, who do some great work in this regard. And here we have 3 lines, which are year-over-year changes in median sales prices for urban, suburban, and rural areas. And you can see these move very closely with each other, but then sometime in March, the fly hit the windshield and things splattered, right? So we had an initial sharp pullback. Oh my goodness, what's going on? Followed by recovery, a startlingly fast recovery, but a recovery in which these lines diverge. People are fleeing density and moving to suburban and even rural areas, since the technology allows you to do this now. You know, seeing this remarkable change in the entire fabric of the U.S. housing market. Okay. Besides the change in distribution of location, we seem to be in a situation where we are accelerating the changes in income and wealth inequality that have plagued us in this country for a pretty long time. So we can see here, I'm looking at this at the top end, right? So again, from Redfin, you're seeing the luxury market up 41% year over year, expensive up 17. These are sales, not prices, and much less in the more affordable categories to a large degree because there isn't much supply, but also because the individuals here are probably suffering the most from the COVID crisis. What I have here on the bottom right is the inadequacy of our current policy to deal with this. This is a distribution of home prices for mortgages that are issued by the US agencies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, by price range. And you can see back in January 2019, about 12%, you know, perhaps, yeah, 12% of these properties had prices in excess of $500,000, and that is now about a third of the market. So our policy resources are being moved to the higher end of the spectrum, which is certainly problematic. On the demand side, we're looking at the impact in terms of the impact on households with different incomes, with different educational attainments, and with different races. And what we can see very clearly is access to working from home is more available the higher up you are in the education spectrum, the more white you are, and the higher earning you are. And the little Zoom thing was sent to me by a good friend from the IMF, which somehow I think is also appropriate. So the question now is, what happens here? And especially for the long run. So when I'm talking about, say, in my company, Recursion, we're a fintech company, we're 15 people or so, we scattered to the 4 winds in March. We're working quite well. We've come to the conclusion that we can make this go, and people working from everywhere. The alternative issue, though, is my role as an educator and at Columbia. How do we feel? How does Columbia feel about me working from home and teaching? And the answer is, of course, well, not very well at all. I got an email just last week saying that as soon as there is a vaccine available, an assistant dean is going to come to my house. I think that's the guy up there. Paul, perhaps you got that email. But more seriously, I'm kind of torn, right? You know, I have this close to the city and then the desire for space. And I think that that is reflected in society as a whole. So, you know, we're looking at, in terms of the long-term impact of this, a couple of things. One is what the behavioralists call belief scarring. That is, there is a tremendous benefit to being packed densely, having people work close together with urban amenities, right? And that is becoming challenged now. You have more space and more time if you're not commuting from the suburbs. And so we are reconsidering our preferences this way. The other possibility, of course, is buyer's remorse. We'll move to the suburbs and in 3 years decide we're not having as much fun and we'll reconsider. I have no idea how this is going to end up. But I think these are the questions and the framework to think about it. What I have on the bottom are different alternatives. On the lower right is the Farley Post Office, which is right next to Penn Station in New York. That has just been taken in a long-term lease by Facebook, where they're going to have something like 10,000 new people move there in a couple of years. They're making a strong statement that young people are going to want to return to the city the way that it has before. On the bottom left are relatively new developments. This one's in Connecticut, near train lines to the city. The other alternative is that we're going to see some scattering on jobs on this side. My point is that, and I think this was made earlier, that whatever we get to, it's going to be quite a bit different from how it was before the pandemic, but it's very hard to know in exactly what ways. So this brings us more directly to affordable housing. And what I have here are sort of old and perhaps newer models. On the top left, this is Cabrini Green, the famous public housing development in Chicago. It was torn down something, I think, in 2011, very packed, lots of high rises, notorious for high crime and not clean conditions. And then, of course, you're packing people into the subways, perhaps in Chicago, it's the L. But on the top left, what's happened is gentrification, right? That building is gone, but we have put in new developments, and these townhouses can cost $450,000 to $800,000. So we've gotten rid of the affordable housing, but and perhaps the blight that came with that complex, but it's been replaced by something that hasn't provided lower income folks a place to live. On the bottom is sort of a different paradigm. This is, perhaps if people are going to move to the suburbs, that we're going to need affordable housing. You can build this further out in the exurbs. And then the transportation issue is not getting around a packed city, but bringing people to employment opportunities, which may be pushed over a broader area. So the point I want to make here is that where to live and where to work is a joint decision. We're going through a process of this at the same time. We're in the middle of the pandemic. We don't know how it's going to proceed. But where to live affordably depends on where lower income households can find work. When everybody was working in an office in the city, there was work around in service, in service providers and restaurants and in cultural activities and this sort of thing. But if work and living is going to be more dispersed, then packing everybody in the city perhaps has a problem. When people lived in the city, then we had the white flight to the suburbs, and it became very difficult as the inner city fell. Then when cities became cool, we had gentrification, people were moved out. In all of these cases, it's just terribly important that we have affordable housing options available for people that include some ability to get to an employment situation without too much strain. So if this goes on, if our beliefs about urban living are scarred, there are just many, many problems that we have to address. And so like others, these are topics for conversation rather than something I have an absolute answer on. One is, what do we do with all those compact buildings and infrastructure that are in the city? Can we just clean them up and reuse them? Or are people going to be scared off from that kind of density and we have to find something else? Second, how do our policy tools with which we've looked at affordable housing affected by this? So again, in the US, what we look at to support affordable housing is tax credits, subsidies, and regulation. That is telling the banks that they have to make loans that support the activities of medium and lower income people. Are these are these regulations and programs appropriate in New Age, and how might they need to be changed? Land policy is all the rage now around the world, not just in the US. This was particularly true in a highly urbanized situation. Municipalities tend to own a lot of land. Is it being applied to help deal with these problems, land banks and this sort of thing? And the other thing is inclusionary property, right? Municipalities own.
Excuse me, Richard. I just want to note we need to wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, I'm all set then. This is the very end. Anyway, and inclusionary housing. And so, and last is how do the cities fund themselves in the new normal? So thank you very much. I look forward to future discussions.
Thank you very much, Richard. I really appreciate that. Excellent presentation from my colleague at SIPA. I want to highlight just a few things that of everything we saw that I found quite interesting. You know, we're seeing that with the data that Richard shared with us, in addition to the excellent memes, but the data really reflects this flight that we, as Richard said, we seem to have been here before. This flight from urban to suburban. Those who have the means, given the socioeconomic dynamic at play, those who have the means do seem to be leaving density, but those who don't aren't. And so there is some shifting, but not complete shifting. And then the question, this fascinating concept, belief scarring. I'd never heard it phrased this way before, and I found it very useful. Belief scarring, and the question that belief scarring raises is, how sticky will the life changes that we've made during COVID be? How sticky will these changes be? How sticky will this effort to adapt prove? So, Richard, once again, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. This was truly, truly insightful. And so with that, we're going to now hear from Marco López-Silva, but before, I'd like to ask Pankti again to please introduce our speaker. Marco, it'll be 10 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Richard. Our next speaker is Marco López-Silva. He is the Executive Director of Fundación Idea, a leading public policy think tank, and C230 Consultores, a boutique strategy and public policy consultancy in Mexico. He is a civil engineer and holds a master's in public policy from Harvard. He has supervised dozens of projects regarding urban development, housing, mobility, climate change, and social inclusion. His work has been published by Harvard University, the IADB, USAID, the Mexican Senate, and Infonavit, the largest quasi-public mortgage lender in Latin America. Thank you, Marco, for joining us today. I invite you to kindly make your presentation.
Thanks a lot, guys. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, for the introduction. I'm going to be talking today about some of the challenges implied by COVID-19 for affordable housing in Mexico. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. So we are a think tank based in Mexico City, and a lot of our work is regarding urban development and more specifically housing. And one of our most recent publications, that is the first one in the table, identified things that work and things that don't work to try to get authorities and developers to promote the former and discontinue the latter. And that was jointly produced with Infonavit. And I'm going to draw on one of the case studies included in that report today. And also a previous study we did in 2014 for the Mexican Senate. It also touches on issues relevant for today, as it discusses how we really need higher densities in our cities, but higher density does not automatically translate into better quality of life. It must be done in a certain way. Both reports are available on our website. Can we see the next slide? I'm going to give you just some general context so that some of the things that I'll touch upon in subsequent slides make sense. I'll briefly talk about the Mexican housing market. We had a housing boom for more than a decade, starting in early 2000s. That was facilitated mainly by two things. The first one was a set of large upfront subsidy programs that enabled demand. And on the other hand, by an expansion on mortgage issuance by Infonavit, which I think it's the blue line in the graph. Infonavit is a quasi-public mortgage bank, and it's the largest in Latin America. And basically, as you can see in the graph, mortgage issuance in the country almost tripled from 2000 to 2007, 2008. Next slide. The results of that housing boom were bittersweet. On the positive side, millions of Mexicans had the opportunity of becoming homeowners. Of course, we can have a discussion on whether that is a good outcome or not, actually, but it would be a long one. But also shortcomings in housing construction quality improved, as did the lack of access to services such as electricity, drinkable water, sewage, and so on. However, on the other side, to try to mass produce cheap housing, developers resorted to purchasing housing appropriate, quote unquote, cheap land on the outskirts of cities, and this created urban sprawl. Mexican cities' footprint grew much more rapidly than their population. And as you can see, the example of Mexico City on the right, that was dramatic. And Mexico City's case is not even by far the worst case in the country. Also, on the negative side, a large problem of uninhabited or even abandoned housing units ensued. The next slide. So to try to correct the situation, the Mexican authorities tried some things, mainly two. First, they introduced the idea of urban containment perimeters. These perimeters are defined in terms of density of jobs and services. I'm simplifying the concept a little bit, but the general idea is that perimeters which imply better locations. So for instance, the red ones in the map receive higher incentives, and some areas, for instance, the blue ones in the map are not eligible for subsidies. That was the first approach. And then also they reduced the size of the subsidy programs dramatically over the past years. Now, interestingly, a fraction of developers resorted to innovation on their part to try to make a more reasonable proposition to the market. Can we see the next slide? So what we found in the first study that I was talking about in the first slide, some private developers identified some design elements and decisions that enable them to produce more centrally located housing. However, these design decisions imply trade-offs, and this is especially true under a pandemic. So for instance, in order to achieve better locations, developers had to increase density, and this can lead to the perception of overcrowding, of course, especially when people had to spend very large amounts of time in private spaces. Also, to compensate for smaller private spaces, developers have offered shared amenities, for instance, gyms, or providing shared spaces for parties, etc. However, ventilation was not necessarily taken into account as a design requirement, so many of the currently available shared spaces in developments are not appropriate for use during the COVID-19 pandemic and so on. The next slide. I am going to show you a development which I particularly like to illustrate these trade-offs and complications. This again comes from the first study that I was talking about in the first slide. It is called Bosco Residencial. It is an affordable housing development in Hermosillo in the northern state of Sonora. You can reach Hermosillo by driving about 3.5 hours south from Tucson, Arizona. And it's the same desert, so it implies temperatures higher than 86 degrees for about 7 months in a year. But as you can see in the map on the right, Bosco's location is well within the city limits. The next slide. The developer worked with a very well-known architect internationally, actually. His name is Alberto Calech, and to afford building affordable housing on this land, the developer needed to achieve a much higher density than usual for the city. They applied for an exemption to rules regarding plot size, design of streets, etc. They ended up getting approval for very narrow housing plots. Their width is equivalent to that of 1.5 cars, to give you an idea. And the streets are low speed and they don't have sidewalks, which is quite unusual for Mexico. As I hope you can see in the leftmost floor plan, you enter to a small living room, followed by a kitchen and a dining area, and then there's a patio at the back. And that's really relevant for the city as people load their carne asadas. And then as you can see in the upper right, in the section, you all go up one level to find a bathroom, and then a bedroom. And then you go up again half level to find the second bedroom. The next slide. These are not detached houses. They are built on modules of 4, which share the exterior walls. They are 2-bedroom, 1 bathroom in 785 square feet. I realize that this is about the same size of the average apartment in Manhattan. However, for its segment in Hermosillo, that would be probably considered on the smaller size, the smaller side of the offerings in the market in terms of square meters. However, in terms of three-dimensional space and in perception, the story is quite different. The social area feels quite ample due to the fact that there are no internal partitions of space, and because of the double height, it also has clear views from the entrance all the way to the patio, and you can see through the stairs. On bedrooms, partitions are not walls properly. They are wooden panels with glass on the upper part, which is a really good idea to allow for light to go through from one end to the other of the house. And the doors are sliding, so you don't have swinging doors that take up space. However, in this age of COVID-19, some compromises implied by the design become much more apparent, right? So if you're working on the dining table or the living room, and there's someone cooking, you're going to have visual distractions and noise. And if children are taking class in bedrooms, you're going to be hearing them. The next slide. If we take a brief look at the outside, the developer provided a shared area comprising two elements. First, a small reading room with an air conditioning. And now we know that regular AC arrangements are not a good idea with a pandemic that is airborne, right? And there's also a shaded area with seating arrangements. At the end, I think it's a really functional shared area under typical conditions, but it's relatively small for 142 families to use when there's a protracted lockdown, of course. Can we see the next one? Thank you. So to finish, to wrap my presentation up, designing comfortable and safe housing under a pandemic such as COVID-19 requires good design and innovation. It has happened before, certainly. The Spanish influenza pandemic, for instance, brought changes in design, such as this idea of having a restroom very close to the entrance of houses so that visitors could wash their hands rapidly. However, innovation implies high financial risk. The developer who decides to innovate faces significant challenges when they adopt new construction techniques or designs, and it is quite common for developers to face unexpectedly high construction costs, for instance, when trying new things. That was certainly the case with Bosco. You can find some details in the publication. And also they cannot be sure about whether an innovative housing prototype is going to be commercially successful. A relevant obstacle in this context is going to be that normal financial instruments, such as loans by private banks or even by quasi-public institutions, are not designed to promote or incentivize innovation. We could use in Mexico, for instance, a program to subsidize projects with potential demonstration effects, such as Bosco, or at least 3 or 4 more examples that you can see in our publication in the sense of prototyping. However, in Mexico, the federal government is prioritizing investment in other areas. So resources devoted to housing subsidies are much smaller than a decade ago. So this is not let's say that financing for housing innovation is not an idea that is getting traction in Mexico. So that is going to be quite a challenge. I think that's it from me. So thank you.
Marco, thank you very much. Pankti and Ricardo and Sung, who are taking my urban policy course, will tell you that the dynamic that you are displaying, it should be familiar to them because we actually discussed the Mexican case last Tuesday in class. And so the data that you brought to bear on that issue, plus these innovations, this, what has happened since, what are these efforts since, I think we will all find, or we've all found fascinating. Just a few things. I had not heard about Bosco. I am from Mexico. I had not heard of Bosco. I've learned tremendously. I look forward to learning more about that particular development. I have questions that, you don't need to answer right now, but just, I was wondering about the unpaved area. I'm wondering if it has to do with water capture. And that seems to be kind of in line with allowing for natural light to come into these apartments, ventilation or across the spaces in these apartments. So it seems to be a development that's more in tune with the environment around it. And I found that really interesting and really compelling. I also learned for the first time why my restroom here in my apartment is next to the entry to the apartment. Maybe it is because of the Spanish flu. So fascinating fact right there. So Marco, again, thank you very much for your presentation. Fascinating.
Thank you.
Last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from David Cleghorn, and I'm going to ask again, Pankti, to please introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Paul. I will now be introducing our last speaker, David Cleghorn. He serves as the Chief Housing Officer for Help USA and oversees the permanent housing development and operations for the organization. This includes management of the pre-development process, financing and construction, and long-term asset management and building operations. Additionally, he is a key member of the central leadership team at Help USA, participating in ongoing organizational planning and strategy. He has been integral in the organization's expansion through developments for LGBT seniors in the Bronx, veterans, and family housing, to name a few. David has a strong background in community-based real estate development with a focus on affordable and supportive housing. Thank you, David, for joining us today, and I invite you to kindly make your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to participate. I think I'm probably considered to be like the practitioner of the group, maybe the one that is working day to day, sort of in the field, so to speak. I am the Chief Housing Officer at Help USA. We're based here in New York. If you go right to that second slide there, the one with the map, yep. We're based here in New York City. We're an organization of close to 2,000 people now. We like to call ourselves a national organization. We're sort of kind of a national organization. We're in these different states and also Nevada, which is pretty far away from New York. If you're in New York, I can see that if you're in Italy, it probably seems pretty close together. And we're very well aware of that parking lot of homeless people in Las Vegas, which was a very terrible idea by the city. We operate homeless shelters for families and for single adults. We also operate domestic violence shelters, and we develop and create affordable housing. You can go to the next slide. This is just sort of a general overview of what the organization does. We operate programs to try to keep people from becoming homeless. If they are homeless, then we operate the shelters with an army of staff that's designed to try to get people back into permanent housing as quickly as possible. And then we build permanent supportive housing and affordable housing, which is really the work that I do. That picture on the bottom right, not a picture, but a rendering, is a building that we're about to open really any minute. We're going to get our certificate of occupancy, and that'll be our newest project for senior citizens that have identified as LGBTQ and are also low income and homeless. Go to the next slide. So we've, on the permanent affordable housing front, I've been in this working in affordable housing, either at neighborhood-based community development corporations or now for the last 8 years at a larger nonprofit. I've been doing it for quite a while, and there's certain best practices, and those best practices have generally been, up until recently, try to build dense, try to get as many people housed as possible, try to create economies of scale on your development budgets and your financing costs so that you can most effectively help the most people. And it's a model that works really well. If that building in the building on the left in Buffalo, those apartments are pretty small, sort of some of them about the size of the apartments that Ricardo just showed. And the same goes for the one in the middle. The middle one is sort of an example of what New York City has been doing in the last few years, where that's 48 apartments that you can't tell from the picture, but that building was built on the site that 2 single-family houses were on in the Bronx. It goes up 7 floors, and it has 48 apartments in it that are less than 500 square feet each for single formerly homeless seniors. They're really packed in there, though. It's a very dense building. The one on the right is just a picture of the building that was in the rendering. So you can go to the next slide. So, you know, we're just sitting here building permanent supportive housing and operating shelters and minding our own business, and then we get slammed with a global pandemic back in March, and we had to quickly pivot and figure out how to deal both on the shelters and in our permanent housing to keep people safe. Here in New York, our shelters are quite literally people on top of each other. The single adult shelters are dormitory style. You have like 4 or 5 people in a room, and our family shelters are basically small apartments. In our permanent housing, we have a lot of supportive housing, so folks with mental health issues, substance abuse issues, anxiety issues that we had to be very careful about making sure that those folks felt safe and comfortable in their homes. And the approaches we took were really different, drastically different, depending on the shelters and the permanent housing. And I'm focusing on the permanent housing. So, you know, we immediately went into an enhanced cleaning protocol. We put directional signs in the buildings, temporary hand washing stations. We had Doctors Without Borders came into New York and came and visited a lot of permanent supportive housing sites and helped people figure out a strategy for keeping people safe. We were able to quickly buy enough personal protective equipment for our staff and for our residents. And we came up with policies to encourage permanent housing residents to isolate if they had been exposed or if they had been sick. And we were really sort of pleased that in New York City, we didn't have a single person in permanent housing pass away from COVID. We had 3 in our portfolio, which is unfortunate, and we had very few in our homeless shelters. So our response was really good. I think we were out in front of it. The issue, though, becomes one of how do you continue to pay for that level of service. Revenues, the rents are down in our portfolio by about 12%, and our costs are up by about 20%. And it's important to understand that before, you know, in these kind of housing projects, you have very little net operating income to begin with. They're more or less designed that way. So when there's an off-balance situation like this, it really causes some problems. We're fortunate enough to have building reserves and an opportunity to fundraise because we're a nonprofit, but that's not a long-term solution. We are a city developer. We're an urban developer. All of our projects are in cities. We believe that there's going to continue to be a need for permanent and supportive housing in urban areas. There's really many barriers to entry for poor people moving into the suburbs. There's zoning restrictions, there's density restrictions, there's lack of access to transportation and jobs. People not wanting the children of poor people in their schools. It goes on and on. It's a very ugly situation. So we're sort of continuing along. We've got 2 projects in construction that we just closed on the financing. And what are we going to do? How are we going to make our buildings safer for people? We also assume that there will be there'll be an end to the coronavirus, the COVID-19 crisis, but you'd have to be kind of crazy to think that there won't be something else in the future that comes up similar to this. We hope that it won't, but you can't plan on hope. So we're starting to rethink how do we build apartment buildings that are safer. So we're really looking at directions. How do we get people to move into, go into the building, into their apartment, and out of their apartment, out to the street level with the most amount of space possible? How do we make sure that the buildings are fully wired and accessible for people at low income and fixed incomes to have access to quality internet so that they can work from home and go to school from home? And, how do we integrate some new, technology into our buildings to keep people safe? You hear about products that are being developed that will bathe elevators in UV lighting or disinfectant sprays. Just this morning, I'm in my office. Our maintenance guy came walking down the hallway looking like he was in the movie Ghostbusters with this fogger spray that he's spraying all over the building, which is, he tells me, totally safe for me to be breathing. So, you know, we have to confront those issues and figure out how to do that, and figure out how to do that in a way that it can be paid for. Because simultaneous to, you know, this pandemic here in New York especially, but all over the United States, has caused a huge financial crisis for cities. And cities are some of the primary drivers to funding these projects. So we're gonna really need to have some creative thought and work towards making these buildings safer in a way that people feel comfortable. And I'll give one quick anecdote, and then I'll wrap up. We have, like I said, most of our projects are supportive housing, which means we have formerly homeless people with mental health issues, substance abuse issues living in our buildings. I got a 9 or 10 page handwritten letter from one of our residents in Philadelphia who's convinced that our site staff are trying to steal his VA money, and they're doing so by poisoning him through the air conditioning system. And we're not doing that, I can assure you. But he believes that we're doing that, and we have supportive service people that are working with him. But how is an individual like that going to feel if they get into an elevator and there's a UV light, or if the Ghostbuster guy's walking around the building spraying some kind of fog everywhere? Those are some real issues that we have to deal with when you're working with sensitive and vulnerable populations. I believe I hit all the points I wanted to hit. So I think I'll wrap up there with just one thing, since I got a bunch of really smart Columbia kids on the line. Feel free to reach out to me if you're looking for internships. We could always use some help.
No better way to conclude your presentation. David, thank you so much for the excellent content and the invitation for SIPA's extraordinary students to reach out to you for potential job opportunities. I wanted to use this last presentation to make some connections across the presentations we've seen. But first, David, I want to congratulate you on keeping people safe. It comes across in the numbers that you provided, and that's no minor accomplishment. So well done on that front. It's worth recognizing. So among the connections I've seen, Giulia Lavagna and David Cleghorn spotlight the needs of the most vulnerable. I thought that was an important connection. David Cleghorn and Marco López-Silva seem to have this preference, which I think I share, regarding density. So even after we move past this pandemic, we can't lose sight of the benefits of density, and we can't assume that we're always going to be living in a pandemic. That being said, I think both David Smith and Richard Koss do push back, or do push us to think about, how much will things change? How much will these things we've adapted to prove sticky? It's hard to know. So these are just a few connections. I want to invite two of the organizers. So I want to thank Punky Dalal again for introducing our panelists, but I want to invite two of our other organizers, Tara Daz and then Ricardo Garcia Coin, to offer some questions, some warm-up questions for our panelists. At 2:30 is when we conclude our event. So once we get Tara Daz's question and Ricardo Garcia Coin's question, we'll also turn to questions from the audience, which audience members, please feel free to add your question to the chat, and we will be calling on those questions for our panelists. Tara, please go ahead.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to all the panelists as well for your very insightful presentations. One of the topics that was touched upon is this distinction between short-termism and long-termism in terms of responding to the COVID crisis, as well as responding to addressing the issues that are already existing, as well as responding to public health issues that will continue to plague our societies. And something that's very related to that is how climate change is also going to be inducing a lot of public health risks. And so my question is, to what extent, as we think about health retrofitting and changing the way we address affordable housing in response to COVID, to what extent environmental, climate change and environmental health risks are also being factored in and implemented into long-term changes.
Marco, I had a question for you about the environment and you know what we saw in the development that you shared with us. Maybe you can start us off with a response to Tara.
Sure. So interestingly, I didn't talk about the environmental features of Bosco, but that's one of its strengths actually. So this development, because it is not detached housing, they are individual houses, but they are built in blocks of 4, sharing exterior walls, and they go up to compensate for the narrow width, right? And the architect of this development took a lot of care into managing 2 issues at least, which are environmentally related. The first one is the circulation of air. So it has cross circulation of air from one end to the other. And the second one is adequate flow of light. And those 2, when combined, result in a high energy efficiency and a low requirement for air conditioning. And it is quite notable. So if you talk to the residents of Bosco, they will tell you that they spend much less in their energy bills than what they used to, no? in previous housing units. So I'm saying this because I think that over the past few decades, a lot of developers did try to come up with active ways to increase energy efficiency, for instance, and decrease use of water. But they used active measures and additional devices, that kind of thing, instead of looking into passive measures, such as natural air circulation. And I think that COVID, because of its special characteristics, invites us to go back to that, right? To design that doesn't depend on devices and on additions to the house, but on good design regarding, for instance, air circulation, good use of light, permeability in the soil regarding water and that kind of thing.
Thank you, Marco. Ricardo, you know, the panelists might want to also respond to Taras's question, but I also want to put your question on the table. So if you, now that we've got you back, if you'd like to tell us what's on your mind and pose your question to our panelists, that would be great. That's Ricardo Garcia Coin. Unfortunately, he's having some internet issues. So, you know, in this panel, precisely, we've been talking about the need for internet as a dire need and during pandemic, and we're living through that during this during this presentation. Ricardo, do we have you again? Are you back?
I'm here, but I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go for it.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. Yes, I had a question particularly for Giulia. You manage a wide portfolio of housing projects across the globe. So I wanted to ask you if you have seen any particular practices allowing people to socially distance and avoid wet contacts that more people should be aware about as we move forward.
Giulia, please.
Thanks.
Sorry,
Giulia,
I'm playing the
great.
device and
Yeah.
there's some echo depending on which one I activate. So I probably will have to think about that in terms of effective social distancing. It really depends also on the target that we're looking at. So there are countries where social distancing can happen just simply because of the households. Some members of the house are able to stay in the house and others are still required to go to work. So in a way, they manage to have different time arrangements. I think especially in the poorest area, public spaces still play a crucial role. Like there are countries that were not able to enforce a lockdown, and Kenya being one of them. It wasn't able to enforce a full lockdown, requiring everyone to be closed at home because of the inadequate condition of the homes where most of the population is living. So they simply weren't able to enforce that within the four walls of the house. So there was no official lockdown in place. It was curfews at night, and the social distancing was done mostly through the public spacing. And that's why I'm a keen supporter of the density, because the walkability of a city, it's still needed despite the pandemic. Public spaces and infrastructure now more than ever, especially the public transport, are crucial in preventing the spread of the pandemic and ensuring some kind of social distancing. So these are the things that should be really reinforced, the urban infrastructure, including not only transport, but everything related to it. So I think that especially in poor countries, social distancing is something complex that relies very much on the public areas rather than the private ones.
Thank you, Giulia. Thank you, Ricardo. We do have a comment from Mansi Shah that I will want to turn to, but I want to build on Giulia's response, because I did pick up this general preference across the panelists for density. So I would ask David Smith, I would ask David Cleghorn and Richard Koss to maybe comment on this. How do we know the benefits of density, and we're living through this 2-year period for sure. We'll be living through this time of risk given density. So what do we do with that? Go ahead, please, David Smith.
You repurpose mono-use structures into mixed-use structures. I did a course, executive ed module, for one of your competitors to the north, the Graduate School of Design and the Business School, on affordable housing, and we gave the campers a choice of 4 case studies of stranded assets: limited service hotel, enclosed shopping mall, classical old style office building, and 45-year-old conventional high density garden apartment complex. And we said, how are you going to retrofit this into health secure housing? The significant ideas that emerge from all of that is that you will bring into the build, you will diversify uses within the building. So what was purely residential or purely office, we'll mix them. You will diversify the retail, in particular on the ground floor or the exit points, so that things can be brought in so that you can, if you're going to operate in a live-work environment, you're going to operate there with fewer necessities for going indoors and out of doors. You're also, for larger developments, going to campus-ize. That is, let's say you have, David Cleghorn, you would have this example. Let's say you have legacy public housing or a high-density elderly property that's in wings. Some floors would be isolation spaces, some floors would be socialization spaces, and you would make it possible for people to move within the building without having to move out of the building. And then there are some number of technological retrofits. All the stuff that Marco Lopez and friends were talking about airflow, negative pressure airspace, and so on, will actually happen. What it'll mean is we won't unbuild the urban environment. We'll de-densify the uses of the urban environment, so it's fewer people in more FAR per person, but with intra-building separation between live, work, leisure, shop, and so on.
So David, I hear your answer is adapt, but adapt for density. That's how—
We're not going to unbuild a couple things. We're not going to unbuild the built environment, the high density built environment. Number 2, rural to urban immigration is not going to stop. Number 3, there is a gigantic earnings premium for being in a high density environment. People earn more money because it's easier to make contact with other people. And that is a feature of essentially serendipity and walkability. Now, all those things having been said, we are in a 20 gig broadband work environment world, which has never before existed in human history, at least in the places that we're talking about. So that the hybridization of work, I can imagine a whole lot of people who will commute to the city once a week. They'll go in on Tuesday, they'll come home on Thursday, and in between, they'll be in a thing of the kind I described. and that will be rotated among the workforce so that there will be a certain amount of safe wet encounter and a larger amount of virtual hybrid model encounters. But there's going to be a lot of reinvention because it's too much stranded cost to give up on, including infrastructure. Too much stranded infrastructure. Infrastructure's got to be made to work.
Thank you, David Smith. In terms of, we also want to hear from Richard Koss and David Cleghorn. I want to invite you to comment on this, or Mansi Shah's comment on the chat, or in the chat, which has to do with, you know, the economic strain caused by the pandemic, and how that's the chain reaction that's causing. So if you want to take a look at Mansi Shah's question, or, you know, respond to this other one, which has to do with, you know, what do we do with this preference for density in light of the liability that it currently represents, but will not necessarily represent a year or two from today? David Cleghorn or Richard Koss? Richard?
Hi, thanks for this. No, these are all wonderful topics, and the discussion is very, very informative. So yes, I also go back to Tara's question about climate change and the environment. So there are great benefits from getting people packed closer together. I mean, there's convenience and walkability and this sort of thing. We're discovering that there are costs to this too, in terms of disease and health. And so there's some pressure now to reverse these trends. The technology is abetting it. But another aspect of this is that the idea of the ideas of sustainability and resilience are pretty close to that, to diversification, right? So, you know, we're also taking a risk by having so many of our eggs in relatively small baskets. And so I think what you're seeing is companies looking at building regional hubs too, like you come to the office one day a week in the city, but you also have office space on Long Island or wherever you're located that you can utilize as well. And so you end up with a solution that's kind of in between. But one of the advantages is that if you have a local issue like Hurricane Sandy, that you're not risking the whole basket on one event. So I think that is important, and we shouldn't let a crisis go to waste, right? As we redesign, having resilience and sustainability has to be a core principle, I think, in order to face what is only going to be growing climate challenges in coming decades.
Richard, yeah, we should not let a crisis go to waste. David, we have time, about 2 minutes, to hear from you on any of these topics that come up through the questions, including, again, the question that Mansi Shah brought up. David Cleghorn.
Sure. The one thing I would say on climate change and designing in future buildings is in the affordable housing world, you know, I think a lot of times we are the canary in the coal mine, because we get layered upon us all kinds of requirements that the private sector doesn't have to do or can buy their way out of, including making our buildings greener and greener and greener. We have a property in Maryland that is actually truly net zero. It actually worked. I was a little skeptical, but we actually make $10,000 a year on electricity. But to the question that was in the chat, that question was basically, what's going to happen to people that have accumulated significant debts over the last 8 months, significant rental arrears? And I responded in the chat, but I think that the answer to that, and I don't mean to be overly simplistic, but there's lots of little local area resources that people can tap into. New York City has an eviction prevention programs that will help people get out of rent arrears. Some other cities have something similar that's going to be incredibly strained and taxed as soon as the eviction moratoriums are lifted, and you have 50,000 people being evicted. But those aren't the answers. The answers, in my opinion, to the financial catastrophe that people have found themselves in is going to have to come from the federal level. it can't be done. It can't be all done at the city, at the local or the state level. And by that, I mean, there's going to have to be a true stimulus package that comes out of the federal government, not something like $600 check, but something that invests in infrastructure, invests in jobs, and invests in helping people become more rent stabilized, whether that's helping them get out of arrears or producing more rental subsidy for them. And then, landlords are going to have to take a hit, and they're going to have to write off a lot of this debt. The election is important this year. Every election is important, but this one probably couldn't be more important in terms of the response that we'll see in 2021. So I'll just leave that there.
Thank you, David. So we're at the end of our event. I want to first thank our panelists, Giulia, Lavagna. Thank you very much for joining us and for your presentation. I want to thank David Smith. I want to thank Marco López-Silva, David Cleghorn, Richard Koss. Thank you all for your presentation. There was a question in the chat about the sharing of the material from today's presentation. The question was presented by Karen Zamitis. I want to announce that all panelists agreed to be recording this session and to uploading it on to YouTube. So stay posted. This material will be made available to all and to the public. On that note, again, as further evidence of the organizers' wonderful capacity and execution seen today in this event, Pankti Dalal, Tara Das, Ricardo Garcia Coyne, Sungwoo Park, nicely done. Thank you very much for the opportunity to moderate, to be your timekeeper. Stay safe, and I hope to see you all at another opportunity. Thank you very much.